Works. Trump and the girl from Ben Tre. Next. The meeting over breakfast in Hanoi. What Trump and Putin discussed was kept secret. Because the declassification time was 50 years later, there were some words that were declassified 50 years earlier than the time of publication. The story was declassified 50 years earlier as follows. After a few stories that started off gently, Putin suddenly became thoughtful, put down his cup of egg coffee, and looked straight at Trump. You know, the story in Ukraine is not just about politics or war. It is also a story of history, of people. When it was still part of the Soviet Union, the Russians came to Ukraine, not to invade but to build. They helped the local people develop, work, and live together. Until now, those Russians still stay, living mainly in Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea. But now, they are seen as foreigners, discriminated against, even harmed. Trump raised his eyebrows. So you mean, they want to return to Russia? Putin nodded, his voice lowered. They want to return to the motherland, where they belong. If your Americans were treated like that somewhere, what would you do, Trump? Trump was silent for a moment, sipping his Dalat wine. Of course I would protect them. But, Vlad, the problem is that people don't see things the way you do. The media, politics, they spin the story. You know, the truth doesn't always win. Putin chuckled. I understand. But I see this situation very similar to Vietnam in 1978. Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia was a last resort. The Vietnamese people faced the genocide of Pol Pot. But instead of being supported, they were surrounded and embargoed. The US, China, and the United Nations all sided with Pol Pot to weaken Vietnam. Trump seemed interested. That's strange. I've heard about this, but tell me more details. Putin nodded, slowly telling. In 1975, Pol Pot not only committed genocide but also provoked Vietnam. They even kidnapped an American cargo ship, but the failure of the US military to rescue them was covered up. After that, they continued to be supported by the US and China to fight against Vietnam. When Vietnam was forced to intervene to protect itself and help the Cambodian people, the world turned its back. The United Nations condemned Vietnam and imposed an embargo. But in the end, the Vietnamese people's strong will prove to the world that it was righteous. Trump nodded, his face thoughtful. I'm starting to see the similarities. But the way America acted at that time is probably not what I would do. Putin smiled slightly, raising his glass of wine. I hope so. Because if history repeats itself, all lessons will be forgotten. Russians in Ukraine or Vietnamese in Cambodia all just want a peaceful life. But sometimes, to achieve peace, people have to fight. Trump looked straight at Putin, saying nothing, but his expression said a lot. The breakfast continued in a quiet atmosphere, but clearly, a quiet sympathy had formed between the two leaders. Putin poured some more Dalat wine. His eyes seemed to sink into distant memories. He began to recount slowly, his voice slightly emotional. My friend Trump, let me tell you. Vietnam in the 1970s, after the war with America, was a country full of tragedy. The war ended, but peace was not complete. The country was poor, the people were hungry and lacked clothes. The rice fields in the north were destroyed by American bombs, and the infrastructure in the south was almost leveled. Vietnamese people had to eat corn instead of rice, children went to school barefoot, and adults bent their backs on the barren fields. But in the midst of that tragedy, there will never collapsed. When Pol Pot came to power in Cambodia, he not only brutally massacred his own people, but also frequently violated the Vietnamese border. Pol Pot's troops flooded across the border, massacred villagers, killed women and children, and destroyed houses and fields. Cambodians who fled the Khmer Rouge regime to Vietnam brought with them horrifying stories. People were killed like weeds, forced to work to death, and starved to the point of having to eat tree roots and bark to survive. In such circumstances, Vietnam could not help but act. Not only for self-defense, but also out of a duty to humanity. In early 1979, the Vietnamese People's Army, despite poverty and deprivation, marched into Cambodia. They fought not only with weapons but also with compassion, with the desire to save a nation from genocide. I remember that time very clearly. In the Soviet Union, we were also facing difficulties. But no matter how difficult it was, the Soviet government and people were determined to provide aid to Vietnam. I still remember clearly that my whole family donated a small portion of our salary to various aid programs. The Vietnamese people were a symbol of resilience at that time, and we were proud to be able to contribute to the cause. Trump fell silent, imagining the picture Putin was painting before his eyes. He whispered, as if talking to himself. "So how did they win, Vlad?" Putin took another sip of wine, and replied, "They won by justice, by their strong will and their spirit of sacrifice. The Vietnamese soldiers marched through the jungle, through roads littered with bombs and mines. They entered Phnom Penh as liberators, not invaders. When the Cambodians greeted them with tears, it was the most eloquent proof of why they fought. But it did not stop there. After defeating Pol Pot, Vietnam did not abandon Cambodia. They stayed to help rebuild a devastated country. Every brick, every rice field, every school bore the mark of Vietnamese soldiers. Of course, not everyone understood. Vietnam was isolated, surrounded, and embargoed. Even the US and China supported Pol Pot, just to weaken Vietnam. But my friend Trump, the miracle is that the Vietnamese people did not fall. They gradually proved to the world their righteousness. And now, looking at Cambodia, I believe that history is on Vietnam's side. Trump leaned back in his chair, nodding. What a great lesson. History is often harsh on those who stand up for what is right. But if they can do it, then perhaps we can too. Putin smiled. Yes, my friend. There are lessons from the past that, if understood, will help us find the right path for the present. They clinked glasses, in a peaceful Hanoi, but in each person's heart, there were heavy thoughts about their responsibilities to the world. Breakfast gradually ended, the atmosphere became more comfortable. Putin suddenly looked at Trump, smiling subtly. Trump, I remember an interesting story about Vietnam. Do you want to hear it? Trump leaned forward, looking curious. Of course, I am always ready for an interesting story. Putin nodded, his voice slow, but his eyes were full of meaning. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Vietnam still owed us about $11 billion. The amount of money that the Soviet Union had provided aid during their most difficult years. But when I took office, I decided to cancel that debt. Not because we were rich, but because I knew that it was the duty of a friend. Vietnam was still poor at that time. They needed time to stand firm. And I believe that the relationship between the two peoples is more important than any number. Trump smiled lightly, but his face was a bit thoughtful. That's generous, Vlad. But Russia can do that because they are friends with Vietnam. What about the US? I remember that Vietnam had to pay the war debt to the US, not a small amount. The war debt was about $146 million, plus the debt to the Saigon government before 1975, totaling nearly $535 million. And the irony is, they paid it all, every penny, even though their economy was still mired in poverty at that time. Putin smirked, shrugged. That is the difference between us, Trump. Russia cancelled the debt out of compassion. The US demanded the debt out of economic principles. But, after all, this story is not just about money. It is about how countries perceive their historical responsibility. Vietnam may not be rich, but they have self-respect. They paid the debt not out of fear, but because they wanted to prove that they were not subdued, that they always kept their word. Trump was silent, his eyes distant as if considering. After a while he said, his voice lower than usual. Perhaps you are right, Vlad. History is often a great lesson, if we listen. There are material debts that can be erased, but there are spiritual debts that will last forever. The story of Vietnam is a reminder to me. Strength lies not only in economics or military, but also in pride and resilience. Putin raised his glass, as if to end the conversation. So let's hope that we will not leave new historical debts for the next generation, my friend. Trump nodded, clinking glasses with Putin. Both sat quietly, watching Hanoi through the window, where the sparkling lights reflected on the lake. Although they were two leaders with different perspectives, at least, in this moment, they both felt the lesson from history. Peace and respect are invaluable assets that no country can throw away.